Joining me now, Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
I'm a huge fan of that book, very important book. You did an event, a Bernie Sanders event this morning. You wrote a piece for The Nation magazine called Why Hillary Clinton Doesn't Deserve the Black Vote. Are you endorsing Bernie Sanders?
Well, I am definitely endorsing the political revolution. I am reluctant to endorse any candidate, any Democratic candidate, any candidate in the current political system. I believe that we need to think very seriously, particularly as folks of color and progressives, about building either a new party or a new movement that can hold the Democratic Party accountable or provide a meaningful alternative. But I could not be more thrilled with the movement that is arising all over this country to support the creation of a real democracy in the United States. I think Bernie Sanders is absolutely right to call for a political revolution. We don't have a real democracy today. Our politicians are, pretending to serve two masters: the people who elect them and then the people who fund them. And unfortunately, for millions of people who cast their votes every year, they rightfully wonder whether their politicians are responding more to the people who fund their campaigns, including large pharmaceutical companies, big banks, payday lenders, private prison companies, than the people who have elected them. And
it's interesting that you talk about this sort of democratic problem with big money, because one of the areas that you have focused on, criminal justice, it strikes me as one of those areas where that's not really the story of what's happened, right? I mean, there are private prison interests and they've played some role at the margins, but we basically constructed the largest prison state in the world, not because big business wanted it, but because a lot of really pretty ugly politics on the ground level.
Yes, but I think the larger story about mass incarceration is really about how the interests of poor people and working people of all colors, how people are divided along racial lines in order to advance the interests of a privileged few. And that is really the story of American democracy since its founding, how the privileged few have used race as a way of driving a wedge between poor and working people in order to advance their own interests. It certainly was the case with slavery. It was certainly the case with Jim Crow. Jim Crow emerged in large part in response to a multiracial populist movement for economic justice. And those who were in favor of racial hierarchy and wanted to continue to exploit the lower classes found that they could defeat this populist movement by disenfranchising African Americans and persuading poor and working class whites that they ought to, preserve their racial supremacy in our political system and abandon their black allies. And, after the civil rights movement, we saw similar dynamics emerging again with the backlash against the civil rights movement, creating a political environment where, once again, conservatives and, former segregationists were able to use kind of law and order, get tough on them rhetoric in order to defeat kind of the growing calls for Poor People's Campaign and, the evolution of the civil rights movement into a movement for broader economic justice.
So if the antidote to that is building that kind of multiracial coalition, I think one of the biggest critiques of Bernie Sanders' shortcomings is the fact that he has had a hard time building a multiracial coalition, that his supporters have been overwhelmingly white, that his voting performance has been disproportionately white. I mean, that seems a pretty major obstacle if you want to do that.
Well, that is certainly the critique, although, his recent landslide victories in Hawaii and Washington State, states that are, Hawaii, I think, is the most diverse state in the nation. And there have been great gains for Bernie Sanders among voters of color. I think many voters of color had never heard of Bernie Sanders. I had never heard of Bernie Sanders before the presidential election campaign. And, the reality is that the Clintons are very well known to black folks in particular. And, you know, one of the reasons why I wrote my piece for The Nation is that although, you know, one side of the Clinton story is well known to black folks, the fact that, you know, Bill Clinton was really the first president that ever really embraced black people as human beings. You know, I think it's important when people, you know, talk about, lots of folks ask me, particularly white folks, ask me, you know, why do so many black folks support Clinton when he, you know, his policies were so disastrous for the African American community? And I think many people forget that, you know, we had centuries of slavery where no politician was responsive to our humanity at all, followed by Jim Crow segregation. And, you know, although Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy were allies in some respects, though not all respects, with the civil rights movement and African American communities, there had never been a president or a presidential candidate who actually treated black folks like they were real people who could be viewed and treated as human beings, you know, who weren't a problem to be solved, that didn't treat African Americans as a problem to be solved, but instead would actually sit down and eat with them and sing in their church and acted like they enjoyed, recognized us as human beings. And that's a huge thing. Just as the election of Barack Obama as the first black president is a huge thing for African Americans as a community, it was no small thing for Bill Clinton to reach out to African American communities in the way that he did. And I think many people remember that, especially older African Americans remember that. What they don't know, what they often don't know or don't remember, and is actually one of the reasons why I wrote my book, The New Jim Crow, in the first place, is that many people of color don't know or fully understand how this system of mass incarceration was constructed, why, and the devastating consequences for our communities. And the Clintons, you know, had you know, an important role. They escalated the drug war and the Get Tough movement far beyond what the Republicans had done, while at the same time dismantling the federal social safety net and transferring billions of dollars away from child welfare and housing into a prison building boom unlike anything the world had ever seen. And I think it's difficult and painful for many black folks to face that reality. We'd rather not believe it. And you know, we would like to imagine that, you know, the politicians who were willing to sit with us in church and to be our friends actually might have done vastly more harm than good for our community.
Let me ask you about this sort of crime record, because I think that's been a focal point of a lot of the critique, particularly along racial justice lines. And there's sort of two prongs to this. One is the degree to which Hillary Clinton should bear responsibility for things that her husband signed the law. But the other is that, you know, if you go back and you look at Democrats, black, white, northern, southern, of that period, they're all talking like, I mean, here's Marion Barry in 1988. Telling a television interviewer that he wants killers to be hunted down like mad dogs. I mean, that was the rhetoric around crime at that period in the late 80s, early 90s. Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Marion Barry, mayor of Atlanta, mayor of New York. It's all pretty shocking to the ears of someone in 2016.
Yeah, but I think if you look closely at the records of most of the black politicians and activists during that period, including Marion Barry, they weren't just saying get tough. They were also demanding investment in our schools. They were demanding economic investment. They were demanding jobs, job training, the rebuilding of communities that had been devastated by the disappearance of work due to deindustrialization and globalization. These folks weren't saying, just come in and lock everybody up and then give us police and jails and nothing else. No, they were at that moment in time, in that historical moment in time, there was a real crisis, just like there's a real crisis right now, for example, in Chicago, right? And there's probably many people in Chicago who are living in neighborhoods that are plagued by violent crime that might well say, we need more police. We need to get some of these folks off the street, right? But that's not all they want.
Right.
That's not all they want. They also want their kids to have a future. They want good schools. They want investment to repair the harm that's been done. They want health care. They want drug treatment on demand for those who are suffering with drug addiction. And what we've seen in recent months and in the past couple of years is that now that drug use has become or perceived as a white problem,
yes,
there's this wave of compassion and concern. No one's calling for a war. No one's calling for mandatory minimum sentences for, heroin addicts and for people who are committing these kinds of offenses. The kinds of horrible, grotesque caricatures that were done of, people who are struggling with crack addiction. We don't see that in the media around, the many, many white folks who are strung out on heroin and desperately need support. And yet, we have suddenly, space in our hearts for concern and for compassion and for treatment and alternative approaches. And you don't hear much thumping and calls for war. And I think it has a lot to do with the race and ethnicity of those who are suffering at the time. And in the, early 1990s, urban black communities were suffering from economic collapse. A literal depression was affecting those communities. The unemployment rate had quadrupled in many urban areas. Neighborhoods that were solidly working class, were suddenly turning into ghettos practically overnight. And, at that moment, our nation had a choice. We could have responded with bailout packages, economic stimulus plans. We could have invested in those schools so that the young folks trapped in racially segregated communities might have some hope of making the rough transition from an industrial economy where they once relied on factory jobs to a service-based economy where they needed actually a college education even to make it into the middle class. We could have responded with a wave of care, compassion, and concern, but no. Instead, what did we get? We got the war on drugs, the Get Tough movement, and the evisceration, the end of welfare as we know it. And really the election of Bill Clinton marked the turning point for the Democratic Party, where the Democratic Party decided that in order to win over those so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, in order to get those folks, they were going to have to begin proving to that segment that they could be tougher on them than the Republicans had been. And, I think that's a part of our political history that is painful, I think, for the black community to face, but it's necessary. And, it's my hope that, as the months and years go by, that we will come to see that politics as usual, where the black vote is just taken for granted by the Democratic Party, and we're constantly being told you have to vote for us because God help you if the Republicans are elected. That kind of emotional blackmail and scaremongering comes to an end, and that we, force the Democratic Party to deserve our vote by organizing movements that truly hold the Democratic Party accountable, or perhaps forming another party, which I think the Bernie Sanders campaign has demonstrated that there are millions of people out there who are hungry for a different kind of politics, and who want their politicians to be, treating, the American voters as though they matter. And, democracy itself is a quest to ensure that every person, every human being is treated as though their life matters, their voice matters, their vote matters. And what we've seen is that we haven't gotten there yet. And it will probably take, I'm actually certain it will take a political revolution for us to get there.
Michelle Alexander, great pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.